Okay, everyone, good evening. We're going to dedicate the shir this evening to the memory of a young man who passed away in Israel from a very tragically from an illness. His name was Shner Zalman HaKohen Ben Yaakov Yeshayahu. So our learning should be in his merit, and his family should find comfort in this incredibly difficult time. So the topic of the shir, the title is the power of words. Now, the reason why we titled the shir in this way is because the parsha begins. Of course, there's so much in these two parashiot. They are incredibly long, both long parashiot and very rich in content. There's so much to talk about. But the parsha begins, the first of the two parashas Matot, begins with the description of what happens when a person makes a vow. Right? You look at chapter 30, verse 2, Lamed Pasuk Beis, Vayidaber Moshe al Roshei HaMatos, Livnei Yisrael Lemor, that Hashem said to the Roshei HaMatos, the heads of the tribes, Zeh hadavar shetzivah Hashem, this is the matter that Hashem has commanded, Ishki yador neder Hashem, O Yeshov Hashvol Esar al Nafshe, a person who makes a vow to forbid something on themselves, etc. Lo yachel duvaro, shall not profane his word, K'chol hayotzei mipiv ya'aseh. Whatever comes out of his mouth, that is what the person needs to do. He needs to keep his word. He needs to keep his word. So, the interesting question, which is the obvious one, is what is it doing here? What is the placement of this parasha here? Why does it belong here? In what way? And and this is discussed, of course, by a number of different classic commentators. What I want to do is show you the approach of the Ibn Ezra. And most of the parasha goes on this initial part of the parsha. This chapter describes how those vows can be annulled. There are certain different rules that apply to different groups of people, etc. But what is the big picture here? Now, the Ibn Ezra famously, and we've learned this in the past, is quite comfortable saying that things are not necessarily in the right place. The Ramban, Nachmanides, is very much opposed to that. The Ramban says you follow the chronological order unless it's absolutely impossible to do so because of the context. Ibn Ezra is quite comfortable with understanding in his interpretation, Parshanut we call it, of the Torah. He's quite comfortable with saying that actually this parsha may belong at a different place. We call this Ein Mukdam U'Mu'char B'Torah. Things are not necessarily in the right order, but obviously it has to be a reason and justification. What I think he does here is something fascinating. He provides us with the context for this parsha, and he says it actually belongs somewhere else. And to understand what he's going to say, let's see first of all where he's going to put it. So if you skip through now to the second half of the parsha, which is chapter Lamed Bet, I'm still on the first parsha, Matot, chapter Lamed Bet, right? Chapter 32. 32 describes the fascinating episode of Reuven and Gad. Reuven and Gad have too many flocks. Mikneh Rav, Hayal ibnei Reuven, or Livnei Gad, Livnei Gad Tzumah. They have a lot of flocks, a lot of cattle, etc. And they say, we quite like it here. Thank you very much. We quite like it here on the east bank of the Jordan. It's quite comfortable. We don't want to get involved in the west bank. A long time before. That is literally what they said. And they came along and they said, we want to stay here. And Moshe responds and says, is in shock. Moshe says in shock. He says words which we'll return to later. Chapter 32, verse 6. Words that have echoed down the centuries for the Jewish people, the sense of communal responsibility. And Moshe says to the Bnei Gad and the Bnei Reuven, Ha'achichem yova'u lamilchamo va'atem teishvu po. Your brothers will go to war and you're going to sit here. We're going to conquer the land and you're going to watch. You're going to sit there. You're not going to take part. You're not going to be part of it. Yeah. And he goes on. We'll come back to the context and what he says later. And he says to them essentially, we've gone through this entire journey, and he refers to the spies. That we'll come back to that. They say, and he says, look, you can't do this. This is and basically the agreement they come to is that they will agree to first go and fight, right? In fact, they say, Nechaletz Chushim, we'll be the Chalutzim, the pioneers. We will be at the front of the battle to conquer the land, and only afterwards will we go back and settle on the other side of the Jordan. And that's basically the agreement that they come to. We learn a lot of things from this parsha. We learn about what it means to make a formal agreement. There's a formal commitment, right? It's called a double-sided tanai. They make a condition that is reversible. They say sort of both sides, if we do this, then this, and if we don't do this, we won't have this. In other words, it's a solid commitment, it's an agreement that cannot be broken, and that's the commitment they make. And Moshe says, if that's the case, there is a commitment, and we will accept that. We will accept that commitment. Now, look what it says at again, Perek Lamed Bet Pasuk Chav Zayin, verse 27. Right? We jump around a bit because it's such a huge parsha. I'm still in Lamed Bet. Don't worry. Yeah, chapter 32, verse 28. Verse 28. Right, verse 28. And you'll see the brilliance of the Ibn Ezra in a minute. So, what does the pasuk say? I'm just reading the psukim. Vayitzav lehem Moshe es Elazar haKohen ves Yeshua ben Nun ves Roshei Avos Hamatos Livnei Yisrael. He says, Moshe commands Elazar HaKohen, Yeshua ben Nun, and the heads of the fathers of the tribes, Avos Hamatos, in other words, the heads of the tribes, Livnei Yisrael, to the children of Israel. Vayomer Moshe Aleihem, Moshe says to them, Im Yavru v'nei Gad v'nei Reuven itchem es hayarden, kol cholutz le'melchuma, etc., Lifnei Hashem. If they go in front and they conquer the land first, then they get the Eretz Hagilad, which is on the other side of the Jordan, as an inheritance. If not, they will have to be settled with you in the land of Canaan. They respond and they say, Kain na'aseh, this is what we will do. And then it goes on to say exactly what he gave to them, and he goes on to say how he gave he gave the land to them. Okay? He agreed to them. But what he said was, turn back to the verse 24 now. When he makes the commitment with them, there are critical words that he uses. Verse 24, Chaf Dalet. Benu lachem orim letapchem, ugedeiros letzona'achem. Build cities for your children and pens for your sheep. V'hayotzei mipichem tasu. And whatever comes out of your mouth, that is what you must do. Whatever you've accepted, Rashi says, you've accepted and you've made a permanent formal commitment that you will do this, that you will keep your word. And then we can accept that. And then we can, if you keep your word, you get what you asked for. Now look at what the Ibn Ezra says. Lefi dati, source 1 on the sheets. According to my opinion, he says, Shazos ha-parsha, remember he's talking about the beginning of the parsha, that this parsha, it was after the battle of Midian, sandwiched between the beginning of Parshas Matos, which is the requirements about making a vow, and the second half, which is the requirement, this dialogue with the Gad and Reuven. You have the battle against Midian, right, where they defeat Midian and all the description of the spoil, etc. Right? Okay, he says another parallel example where there is a similar idea where he also explains an order in that way. Skip to the end of the second line, that the pasuk says, Shabol b'nei Gad el Moshe ve'elazar ve'el nesiei ho'edah. It says that Bnei Gad came to the children of God, the sons of God came to Moshe and Elazar and to the Nesiei Ha'edah, the princes of the tribes. V'zachru b'divreihem, I think it's a mistake. And they dibru, I think she said dibru. Dibru divreihem, they spoke their words. V'acharei came, and after that it says, because of the verse says, Vayitzav lehem Moshe es Elazar HaKohen, the pasuk we just saw, Moshe commands Elazar HaKohen, Yeshua ben Nun, and Roshei Avos Hamatos, and the heads of the tribes, Hey Messiah Ha'edah, those are the very princes of the congregation, Hanizkarim, that they mention when they approach. And because Moshe said to the Bnei Gad and the Bnei Reuven, the whole thing there was about, you give your word, it's a word. I'd say he was trusting them. They could easily have backed out. Who was going to go over the Jordan River when Joshua conquers the land and schlep them out if these thousands of people decided not to come? He gives all commitment. He said, I'm going to rely on you. Keep your words. Therefore it says that Moshe said to the heads of the tribes, the Sham Kosev, and there it says, at the end of Pasuk Gimel, right at the beginning, chapter 30, verse 3, we've got the same words. That everything that comes out of a person's mouth he has to keep. That is a very beautiful and brilliant proposal of the Ibn Ezra, right? And what you have here is an understanding as follows, that like so much else in the Torah, we learn a direction of life from the episodes that occur to our ancestors. What is going to impress on the people as individuals that a word is a word? That when you give your word, it's a commitment, and you have to make sure that you keep your word. it's going to be the fact that every individual member of the people observes this trust that Moshe Rabbeinu places in these two tribes. When he says to them, we've made a deal, we've made a commitment, you've given your word that you will accompany the rest of your brothers and their conquering of the land. And I'm trusting you. And because I'm trusting you, he then moves directly on to the same people. Remember, he spoke, also it says that he spoke in front of the heads of the tribes, the same words he used when he came to the dialogue with Gad and Reuven. To the same people, he then gives over the power of personal commitment. Because they are the ones who have observed this, they are front and center of this national commitment, the two tribes committing to the other 10, and they're there and they were part of that commitment. They saw that, and therefore that is the perfect way and the perfect segue into understanding what a personal commitment is and what it means to give your words. So I think that alone is essential. It's a fascinating way of learning the parsha, fascinating perspective on how you need an object lesson to impress upon people the power of words. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu, as with so much else of the Torah, is basically saying, I will show you what it means to trust someone's word. The entire project of conquering the land depends on these tribes giving their word. Remember that Gad were very, very powerful. Gad were highly. Reuven was powerful, not powerful in the sense that he was the oldest, right? Reuven was still the oldest, even though kingship goes to Yehuda. But these were two very significant tribes. They weren't any old tribe. All the tribes were significant. But Reuven is the oldest. He's still the oldest brother. And we know the others have respect as a result of that. And we know with Gad, it says, "V'toraf zroya afkot kod." They were known as mighty warriors. They were able to deal with an enemy by in one blow. They took off the arm and the head in one go. I mean, that's what it means. The Torah, to tear. Torah doesn't mince its words. The Zeroya Afkod Kod. They would take off the arm and the... in one go. So therefore, they were known as mighty warriors. So both of these tribes were critical to the project, to join the military and to conquer the land. And therefore, it was a big deal to say, I'm trusting you. But he does it, and that's the message for the people. But also, if we want to understand, therefore, what the power of our words are, and understand really what that means, we need to really understand more about that episode with Gad and Reuven, and that's what we're going to take a look at now. What is the concern? What is the real concern that Moshe Rabbeinu has when they come forward? Let's look now in a bit more detail at the dialogue that goes on between them. So again, the beginning of Perek Lamed Bet, they come forward, chapter 32, they come forward with their request. They say, we quite like it here, and they said, we want to keep this land. So we already read the first pasuk. Moshe Rabbeinu says to them, this is pasuk Vav, right? Yeah, verse 6, chapter 32. Moshe says, your brothers are going to go to war and you're going to stay here. Velama sni'un esleiv b'nei Yisrael. Very interesting word, sni'un. We're going to come back to that. It seems to mean to withhold, to restrain, to cause to lack the heart of the b'nei Yisrael me'avar el haaretz, from crossing over to the land. Hashem has given kos avosechem. This is exactly what your ancestors did, Moshe says. When I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. And then he describes what happened. They went up to Nachal Eshkol. They saw the land. And they, again, that same word, they held back, they refrained, they caused them a weakening in the heart of the children of Israel. So that they would not come into the land, that Hashem had given to them. And Hashem was angry with them. And he was very angry. And he said to him, if the people who come out of Egypt from the age of 20 years and old, if they will see the land, they will not, in other words, see the land that I've given, the promise. This was the punishment, the 40 years wandering in the desert, except it says, Kalev ben Yefuneh, V'Yoshua ben Nun, they were the only ones who didn't do this, because they followed Hashem. And you had to wander in the desert. Your ancestors, your parents had to wander in the desert. Your fathers had to wander in the desert for 40 years as a result. V'nei, look at Pasuk Yudalet. V'nei kamtem. You have risen up. Tachas avosechem, in place of your ancestors. Tarbus anashim chatoim. Like a gathering, he doesn't mince his words of bad sinners. Lisposo, to increase the wrath of Hashem against the Jewish people. And basically he says, you're going to cause devastation to all this people. So there's a real sense of upset, deep upset and pain in the words of Moshe Rabbeinu. Says the Ramban, source 2 on the sheet. The first point the Ramban makes was the point I mentioned before. He says the Bnei Gad, the significance of Gad and Reuven, right? He says that, I'll just summarize the first paragraph. He says that it mentions the Bnei Reuven first because he was the Bechar. So it says, it says Miknei Rav, Hoya Livnei Reuven v'Livnei Gad. Right, that's what it says. They had a lot of cattle. Reuven is mentioned first because he's the elder of the two. But then it says, "Vayovo'u b'nei Gad b'nei Reuven." They came and they made their request. Right? Why does it switch the order? He says because, and throughout the rest of the parasha, Gad comes first because he says, fourth line down, "Kihem nosnu ha'etza hazos." They actually made the suggestion. He says, "Ve'im oyom medabrim tchila leMoshe b'nachol hazos." They were the ones who actually put in the request before Reuven. And they were stronger, right, than Reuven, than the sons of Reuven, as it says, "V'toraf zroya afkot kod." It says, well, the pasuk I mentioned before, they were very powerful warriors. Therefore, lo hoyu yureim, lo sheves levadom, right? That's why they were not afraid to sit alone, to dwell alone. Ba'aretz hazos, in this land, mipnei yoshvei haaretz, and because of the yoshvei haaretz, they were not worried about. That. Where else, interestingly, as an aside, do we find that that the Bnei Reuven are involved as secondary players and someone else leading?
Story of Joseph.
Well,
he goes on his own.
He goes on his own trajectory there. In other words, Reuven, yeah, okay.
Reuven and Shimon.
Well, they have a partnership. Reuven, yeah. Shimon and Levi, though. That's more Shimon and Levi. But I was thinking of Korach. Because you see Korach, yes?
Sorry.
It's interesting, right? Isn't it interesting, right? There must be more to this. There must be more to this, the significance of good. Because you see, what happens is that the Bnei Reuven, I think Rashi points that out there, if I'm not mistaken, about Oile Rosh, Oile Shcheno, that the negative neighbours are they were next to them, and therefore they were led astray. They were led astray by Korach and his followers. It's a very interesting parallel, something to look into, a bit of homework. Why is it that in both cases Reuven are sort of playing secondary to the leadership of others? It's an interesting parallel. That's the first point he makes. The second one is, look at the next paragraph. In Moshe choshad osom, Moshe suspected them, ki yomru kein mipachad anshe Eretz Canaan. That they said this because they were afraid of the people in Eretz Canaan. She'omru b'hem amaraglim lo nuchala lo sela'on ki chazaku mimenu. We can't go up because they are stronger than us. V'lochein omar lahem, and therefore he said to them, she'einon botchem Hashem ka'avoson. They don't trust Hashem as their ancestors do. Just as their ancestors did. And they'll be punished as like them, to have to stay in the desert. Therefore, so they answered him and they respond, we're not afraid, God forbid, they say. We will go up, armed. We will be the first ones to fight against the enemies of Hashem, because we will consume them. Literally means they are our bread. So therefore, what we see is the Ramban sets out for us what is the essence of the concern that Moshe Rabbeinu has. He is concerned that they will weaken the resolve of the whole people. Right? That is what is going to happen. And you see, therefore, that there is this direct parallel to what happens with the spies, the Meraglim. Because what happens with the Meraglim? It is all about speech. This is why we're going to trace the whole thing through. The Meraglim come back. And they are able, through their words alone, to create in the minds of their listeners, an imaginary scene. They paint a picture which could be completely false. People haven't seen anything. The rest of the people haven't seen anything. They've got the promise of Hashem that they will conquer the land. They paint this picture in their minds as if it's going to be a devastation and there's going to be a terrible disaster. And the people are swept up in that fear and panic, all because of their words, And we find exactly the same thing here, because that is Moshe Rabbeinu's same concern, that the words alone, the fact that they turn around to the rest of the people who they've been traveling all this way through the desert with and say, actually guys, we're quite happy here and we're going to stay here. And that is going to create, again, the words are going to create this image in their minds as if it's all terrible and it's a complete disaster. And I think that is why you find this reference multiple times in the words that we just saw, these psukim, to the Leiv B'nai Yisrael. Do you see that? V'lama tznion es Leiv. Why is it Leiv? Why is it mentioned the heart? Why not just say, V'lama tzniun, why are you causing this problem to the Bnei Yisrael? What is the Leiv Bnei Yisrael? Because it's all about the imagery. It's all about the words. It's all about what you say and the way their minds and hearts, the heart always represents almost the emotion. It's the emotional reaction they're going to have to your words. And that is the parallel between what they say and what the spies say. And that also helps us understand why it is, following the line of the Ibn Ezra, that from this we learn how a person's words can have such impact and have such power, make such a difference. Because look, these episodes, you trace it all the way through. The spies did that. This is the concern Moshe Rabbeinu has with them. And it's the same thing with the words that we say. Where does speech come from? Speech is first. It comes the first thing. You say, speech always follows. The peh comes first. It comes first and then the action follows. And that's the concern.
This has horrible resonances with exactly what's going on today. To me, anyway, in Gaza, when what is being heard and said is not necessarily the truth, but it's what people want to hear, and it's frighteningly relevant, even though this is possibly 3,000 years old.
Well, firstly, as we've mentioned many times in this shiurim, is that when we understand and we just read the words properly, we immediately see just how directly relevant it is to everything we live through and speak of. That's not a surprise. But you do see that the pattern of being who is able to control the narrative is extremely important. And that is why Moshe Rabbeinu, as the leader in a position of leadership, he immediately responds in this way, with really forcefully. Your actions have the potential to change the whole narrative. We are now moving into the land finally after 40 years, and you're going to create a new reality, and that may distort what exactly is happening in reality on the ground. Much more to say, but obviously in the context. No, it's okay.
Was there nobody living on this land at the time?
Of course there were. Lots of people.
Was there any conquering going on?
Oh, there will be.
Where Reuben and Gad wanted to...
where they were there. No, they had to. I think that's what it says at the end of the Parsha. They had to. Although they had been involved in... Yeah, they had been involved as well. You see, they had conquered already Sichon and Og, and that's where it was. At the end of Parshas Matot, there's no time to go into it, but it lists the cities. It lists the cities that they settled in, right, where they exactly lived, etc. And it says there that certain places they had to go and conquer. So they did have to go
also, in the desert, how come they got so much cattle? I mean, what exactly dry desert?
From big cattle come small cattle, as it says in Fiddler on the Roof. That's a paraphrase. Okay, look it up. Yeah. You know the line? Yeah. Anyway, whatever. So that's how they get cattle, right? I'm saying they brought cat flocks with them, and the flocks then become bigger flocks.
It's not exactly the place for the water. Careering cattle somehow.
Okay, yeah, they had water with them. We know they had water with them.
What you see now in terms of vegetation is not necessarily what was there 3,000 years ago.
Yeah, they had. Anyway, let us not get sidetracked too much. So we are going to see now. So look. So this is the first thing. The second parallel I just want to bring before we deal with a fascinating puzzle that occurs with this whole parsha is just a brief look at the Ksav v'Hakabbalah. Ksav v'Hakabbalah we've maybe quoted on a few occasions Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, who died in 1865 in Königsberg. So he was a Rav in Germany at that time. And he points out, again, a parallel with the beginning of the parsha and this one. And this word that I mentioned before, V'lama tni'un, or sni'un, which means, Rashi says it means Rashi says tasiru v'tamniu. Sorry, Rashi's not here on the page. Libam me'avor. That basically you remove and you withhold their heart from going forwards. She used Svurim, just reading Rashi, that they would think Sha'atem Yureim La'avar, you'd be afraid to pass Minei Milchoma because of the battle, the Chozek Ha'arem, and the strength of the cities and the people, right? So therefore it means to withhold. The Ksav HaKabbalah in his commentary is not on this pasuk, but it's at the beginning. It is right at the beginning, chapter 30, verse 6, and there it says like this. It says V'imheini Avia Osah. So we're not going to go into all the technical details, but basically, if a father hears a vow made by his young daughter, he has the ability to annul that vow on that day. Okay, the rules and regulations around this are complex. We're not going to go into it now. We're just going to look at this word. V'imheini Avia Osah. It says if the father withholds from her, heini Avia Osah b'yom withholds it from her, which is a reference to the annulment process that he does. Now that word is the same root, right? To be made to v'imheini, withhold. And the Ksav HaKabbalah tells us that the words mean, I mean, he says it here, Rashi later on there says that Heini means, he quotes Rashi, it's Loshen Menia v'hasara, to withhold or to remove. Okay, and he says that's the same as Lama Tzni'un, to withhold or to remove. And he says that you see from here, there are two meanings to this word. There is to withhold, and there is also to remove. And these are two different words and two different meanings. Third line down. Yesh havdel beinehem. There's a distinction between them. Kehavdel sheyesh ben hasara sarotzen lebein menia sarotzen. As the distinction is between the removal of will and the withholding of will. And that is as follows. When it says that they remove, it says Vayoniu esleiv b'nei Yisrael, there are two ways of understanding what that means. The actions of the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, on the one hand, could be understood as they removed the will from the people. Shesiru es ritzon libon, the will that they had to enter the land. They turned the whole perspective on the land that they had. So that's one way of understanding it. If it means, though, he says to withhold as opposed to remove, their will is still there, but they're just afraid. It's withheld from them. Because of the fear of the war and the strength of the cities, their will is weakened until they don't have the ability to actually carry it out in action. So the Ksav HaKabbalah tells us that this one word has two distinct meanings, which can mean very different things in terms of the impact, right? On the one hand, it can mean removal, hasara. And that means the removal of a complete desire to enter the land, because they say, we don't want to go there anymore, this scary place, we really don't want to go there. But it can also mean, that's hasara, but it can also mean mini'ah, to just withhold. We want to, but we're not able. We want to, we're desperate to get there, but you're withholding us, you're just keeping us back. And therefore we also see the fact, from here I think we understand again, this another lesson in the power of speech. The incredible impact that words can have. Words that we say can, especially if they have a negative impact, which is what we're turning here to, they can do one of these two things. Sometimes they can cause a weakening of resolve. In other words, the person that's withholding, the person wants to do something, but the words have an impact that they feel like, I'm just too nervous to do it now, it's no good. Or it can completely remove the whole interest in the whole thing. And it's interesting to look at that, I think, in the context of those words, right? These words, your brothers will go to war and you will sit here. And I think we understand from here the power of words in Chutz La'aretz, the power of words outside Israel. Because there are situations and circumstances where, unfortunately, people have not been as careful as they should be about their words from outside Israel. And sometimes we think, well, what can we do? We're not being called up to fight in the IDF, we're not being called. But we can be careful about our words, careful of the words we say. Even if there are situations and circumstances where we feel, well, I should say something. Understand the power of words, understand the weakening and the damage the words can do. Just a powerful message, and that is what we see from this parasha. It's very important. And that can be understood on many different levels, but it's an important observation from this parasha, and that was what Moshe Rabbeinu was saying to them. I want to deal now with the puzzle of Menashe. Okay, this is a fascinating thing. Who actually ends up on the other side of the Jordan? Yeah, Gad and Reuven, and half the tribe of Menashe. When is the first time we find out that Chatzi Shevet Menashe, half the tribe of Menashe, are going to end up living on the other side of the Jordan with Gad and Reuven? A long time afterwards. In other words, basically, we went through most of it. We've gone through a lot of it. So we're turning now back to chapter 32. You see, we went through most of it. The demand at the beginning is absolutely clear. Reuven and Gad have a lot of flock, and they come and they say, we want to stay here, etc., etc. They have a whole dialogue with Moshe Rabbeinu, and he goes back and says, how can you do this? And they say, no, we're not scared. We're not going to make anyone. They said, we're going to build cities, but we're going to go and we're not going to come and settle them until we have joined and conquered. And Moshe then makes the condition with them in verse 20. If you do this and you go first, and you go and you conquer first, and the land is conquered, and if you don't do this, it will be forever a sin to Hashem, and etc., etc. And they said, we'll do exactly what you say, and we'll pass, and we'll be the warriors in the armor, in the vanguard of the people, etc. And they answer and they say, and then look at verse 33. So it's just said, we're going to go ahead, they made the whole agreement. Right, verse 33, Lamed Gimel. Vayitain lohem Moshe. Yeah, and Moshe gave to them, Libnei Gad, Libnei Reuven, V'lachatzi Shevet Menashe ben Yosef. And Moshe gave to Gad and Reuven and half the tribe of Menashe, the son of Yosef, the land of Sichon, and the king of the Amorites, and Og, and everywhere else. And then it describes the cities they built. And this is a real puzzle. It's fascinating. Menashe is not mentioned at all until this pasuk. They're not involved in the request. They're not involved in anything at all. And Moshe, and the Torah doesn't explain why. It doesn't explain why half of Menashe are meant to join them. You're splitting families. You're splitting a whole tribe. The half will stay inside. Half will stay on the other side of the Jordan. Who says they wanted to go? Who make fascinating, right? From all perspectives. So what is the reason for this? Rashi here, interestingly, doesn't comment, which is probably an interesting thing to look into in and of itself. The Netziv says, Hamek Dover, the Netziv, he says as a great leader in the 19th century in Lithuania, he says like this, Lachati Shem Menashehim, Hey Malo Bikshu, source 4. They did not request, Himavur Yerushalmi Bikurim. They did not make the request, as the Jerusalem Talmud says us in Bikurim. Ela Moshe Bikesh Mehem. Moshe, he asked them. The request did not come from Menashe. It was the other way around. Moshe, behind the scenes here, turned round to Menashe and said, I want half of you to join them. Then he very cryptically says, Kimavua Hatam Sefer Devarim, as is explained, the reason in Sefer Devarim, chapter 3, verse 16. Right? That's what he says. He says, you've got to look there and you'll understand the reason. Okay, I need a chumash actually. Have you got a whole chumash? I've only got Devarim. Sorry, I've only got Bamidbar. Right. So again, I know some of you have it, but it's in obviously the article. So look it up. Let's look it up. No one sees the context here. So let's look it up. What is going on here? Okay. So what is this cryptic reference to the Netziv? He says, you want to understand why Moshe asked them to go. He says, you have to look it up in Devarim chapter 3, because that fills in the gaps. Now we know that the beginning of Sefer Devarim recaps, right? Moshe Rabbeinu at the beginning of Sefer Devarim recaps a lot of the details of the journey in the desert, right? He details the places they had to capture on their way to the land of Israel. A lot of the details are set out here, right? Now, let's look carefully at what it says over there. So we got Perek Gimel. Now he's talking in the past tense. He's talking about how we conquered these cities. Okay, and it says, Pasuk Good Base, verse 12. I mean, you understand? About Perek Gimel, Pasuk Good Base in Devarim, beginning of Devarim, and it says after it talks about the size of Og's bed. Very interesting in and of itself how big Og's bed was. We conquered that land at this time. From Aroer, which was on the banks of the Arnon River. Chatzi HaGilad, Har Gilad, half of the mountain of Gilad, Va'arav and its cities. Nosati I gave, L'Ruveni V'Lagodi. Fine, Reuven and Gad. The Yesa HaGilad V'Chol HaBashan. The rest of Gilad and the Bashan, you can look up, there's maps of exactly what it looked like. Mamleches Og, the kingdom of Og. Nosati lachatzi shevet HaManashe. You know Og was the giant, yeah? Lachatzi shevet HaManashe. I gave it to the half tribe of Menashe, and it describes Kol Chevel Ha'argim V'Chol HaBashan, Hahu Yekorei Eretz Rephaim. That is called the land of the giants. Okay, or Rephaim, how we translate Rephaim. And then it says, Yair ben Menashe went, and he conquered, he took these places, and he called them after his name. Okay. Now, look at 16, Tezayin. To Reuven and Gad I gave from the Gilad to Nachal Arnon, within the river and its borders, and to the Yabok HaNachal, which is the border of the Bnei Ammon. So to understand what all these places are, you have to look in a biblical atlas, and you have to piece them all together. Okay, what's the puzzle here?
It doesn't mention Menashe.
It mentions Menashe in the middle, so that's okay. But why Menashe in the middle? It starts off talking about these lands were given to Reuven and Gad. Then it says, Moshe recounts and says, and I gave this land to half of the tribe of Menashe, and then it goes back to Reuven and Gad. It goes back to Reuven and Gad. You would expect, logically, that it would first set out what Reuven got and Gad got, and Menashe afterwards, or vice versa. Menashe is sandwiched in the middle of the two. So here the Hamek Dava says, the Netziv says, and I had to look up his commentary there, that's the obvious thing to do, right? So when I saw that he said here, in this cryptic way, to understand it, go over there. The obvious thing to do is look what he says there, because presumably he's going to explain it, and he does. And he says like this, V'zeu Seder Parsha. This is the order of the Parsha. Shochiach Moshe Yisrael. Moshe rebuked the Jewish people. This is number 5. Can you see? Shachel lachlok nachlas b'nei Gad u'b'nei Reuven. That, again, in Devarim he rebukes, he tells them off, a lot of veiled rebuke for how they've behaved. Here, he rebukes them for beginning to divide up the inheritance of Gad and Reuven. That's that abbreviation, b'nei Gad u'b'nei Reuven. V'lo yochol igmar ad shediber em chatzi shevet Menashe. And he didn't manage to complete it until he spoke with half of the tribe of Menashe, the Gomar Imam v'nisratzu b'chalkom, and he completed it with them, and they were happy with their part. Oz then Yoda Moshe ligmar chilok nachlas b'nei Gad u'b'nei Reuven, and then he knew and was able to complete the division of the land to Gad and Reuven. So basically, he's saying that Moshe was deliberately doing it in this way. He was telling them the history of what had transpired. He began to give out the land to Gad and Reuven. He wasn't able to complete it until he had to stop and ask Menashe to also take some land there, give them that land, and then complete the division for Gad and Reuven. The Davazei says, he says, everyone at that time knew the reason why. And we have to find out, but he says everyone there knew why it was. That the reason was because he meant to explain to them how important it was to plant within them people who were senior figures in Torah learning. From this they would learn for future generations. From there they would learn in future generations always to live in a place where there were Torah scholars, because the life of the Jewish people is dependent on that. This is part of a much longer piece, and he explains through other psukim in Tanakh how we know that Menashe had scholars, right? How we know that. We know Yair ben Menashe and how he came, etc., etc. We don't have time to go into, we don't have time to go into exactly how it is that Menashe are identified with having that role to play. But according to the Netziv, according to the Hamek Davar, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the reason why Moshe makes a request from the half of Menashe to join these two tribes is because he realizes, so to speak, in the middle of dividing up the land, or they taking their land, that they will not be able to survive religiously. They may be able to live on the eastern bank of the Jordan. They're warriors, they're strong, they've got the capability of doing it, and he trusts them that they will come and conquer the land in return. But it's not good enough. There has to be a link. There has to be a bond with the rest of the people. There has to be a tribe that he can rely on, that he knows from the nature of the people of that tribe, that they will serve as educators to Gad and Reuven. And he chooses Menashe for that purpose. Right? One second. He chooses Menashe for that purpose. Okay? Like I said, this is part of a much longer piece, and he goes on to prove why it is that Menashe are the ones to fulfill that role. Okay? We don't have time to go in that now. But the concept is fascinating, because it is a sense of leadership that Moshe Rabbeinu says, I need to keep the Jewish people a whole. I have to keep them together. And yes, they may live there and they may conquer, but who says they're going to remain Jewish? Who says they're going to remain, in a broad sense, part of the people? They're going to be isolated and absent. I'll come back in a second. The Chizkuni fills in a beautiful gap here. He says, look at the next source. B'nai Menashe lo shalu lohem nachal b'eretz Sichon v'Og. Like we just said. They didn't ask for it. They never asked for an inheritance of the land of Sichon and Og. Rak b'nei Reuven v'Gad shalu. They were the ones who asked for Reuven and Gad. Ella, rather, he says, Sha'al yedei she'avihem garam lahem l'shvatim shekaru bigdeihem. The Chizkuni does something which some of our commentators are brilliant at doing. They go back to history. He says, let's understand something about Menashe. He says, I will find an episode. I found an episode much, much earlier in the Torah where Menashe caused great division. Right? What happens? Sha'avihem garam lahem l'shvatim shekaru bigdeihem b'maaseh hagavia. Who is the one who places Joseph's cup in the sack? Menashe. What did the brothers do when they discover the cup in the sack, the gavia? Karu bigdeihem. They tear their clothes. Therefore, Therefore his own portion is divided and torn in two. Bishnei Evrei HaYarden, on 2 tribes of the Jordan River, because everything comes back. Manasseh causes all the rest of the tribes to tear their garments, and therefore his tribe is divided, and it ends up half here and half over there. Now you'll say, okay, that's a nice link, but it's much more than that. Think about it for a second. Think about what's going on here. What happens there? What happens there? What happens there? The background to the tearing of the garments and the gavia, and let me just finish and I'll come take in a second, yeah? You look very worried, bro. You look very worried. You look worried. I will take both those questions in a second. Let me just finish, yeah? So let's understand what's happening here. Over there, the division and the tearing of the garments is used in a negative sense. Ultimately, the background to having to place the cup, at least according to a number of major commentators, is because Joseph is trying to discern if the brothers are going to do the same thing to their brother Binyamin. We know the story, right? That's why he's doing it. It's a test, yeah? So it's a negative sense. The tearing of the garments represents mourning. That's what tearing Karubik Dehem is avelut, right? It's mourning, it's crying, it's weeping. What has happened to us, what has befallen us, we're all finished, we're all over. Here, division is used positively. What is happening here? A division also occurs, but it's a tikkun, it's a rectification. Instead of there where division is used as a negative, it's a negative thing because they sold him into slavery, etc., etc. What is happening here? Here we have a tribe that is divided in 2, but the division is entirely positive. Manasseh is divided in 2 so that the Jewish people remain whole, even though they're in 2 different places. And that links beautifully. J.J. Schachter makes this point about Yosef himself. That if you look carefully, it says in this pasuk in Matot over here, it says that Moshe gave to Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven and half the tribe of Manasseh ben Yosef. Yeah. Why? We know Ben Yosef. We know who Manasseh is. We met him before. Why does it say Manasseh ben Yosef? So Schachter points out because what is Manasseh ben Yosef? Yosef is separated for years. Yosef is the one who is apart, yet retains his religiosity. He retains his spirituality. He remains a part of the Bnei Yaakov, even though he is so far away. So therefore, again, their separation is represented by pain, but someone who carries out the separation remains strong to the faith. Here we have a division which leads to unity. We have a division which leads to connection again, and therefore it's perfectly understandable why Manasseh is the one who is able to link Reuven and Gad to the Jewish people, and also why, in Devarim, he is given the land between them. The way the Psukim are set up, you have Gad and Reuven get some land. Then Manasseh, then Gad and Reuven, because he is sandwiched and amongst the people. And it's a beautiful, I think, perspective on the entire parsha. Now the questions, I know you're very...
I was just going to say that we learned from last week's parsha about the Matot who were great lovers of the land of Israel.
Yes.
So, and they were from Manasseh.
They were from Manasseh.
So maybe that was an idea.
Beautiful.
To steal some of their...
Yeah, beautiful link. They were also part of Manasseh. Very nice. And I mentioned, about the connection of the love of the land. So I didn't mention this in the parsha. I mentioned this in Shul on Shabbos. That according to, there's a machlokes in the Gemara between Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Lezer. There's a debate between Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Lezer as to who their father was. Okay, Rabbi Kiva says the father was the Makosha Sheitzin, the one who gathered wood, right? Yeah. And Rabbi Lezer challenges Rabbi Lezer, amazing Gemara. He challenges him. Rabbi Lezer says to Rabbi Kiva, I don't understand how you can say that. Either, if you're wrong, then you've accused the man of being the one who broke Shabbos. So how can you do that if you're wrong? And if you're right, the Torah did it. Why are you telling us? So Rabbi Lezer says it's not that. He says they were part of the Ma'apilim, the ones who were desperate to get into the land. So I said last Shabbos, that it makes the whole parsha much deeper. Why is it the daughters of Tzalafka come forward and say we want a part in the land? Because they saw their father, how desperate he was after the sin of the spies. Those were the Ma'apilim, they were killed, they didn't succeed, but they were desperate to enter the land. So he was following that trend. Thank you so much for that. Brian, yeah.
The suggestion that the man who runs Yosef's house, which is what text says, from a medrash is Manasseh, is deeply problematic.
Why?
Because assuming it's the same man who the brothers initially insults when they first come to Yosef's house, he comes out with this very strange expression. It says Elokeichem. Manasseh would not have said that.
Okay, the fact that Manasseh may use those words is not necessarily surprising. Says he's
would not have
okay.
denied the Kodesh Baruch Hu.
Okay, but the fact that the fact that he was, as I say, we know from the Midrash that Menashe was the one who was running the household. We say, that's in there. Why exactly and how you reconcile that with the words he uses, that's a fair question. You have to learn the Midrash, you have to understand why it is that he uses those words. I hear the question. I don't think it disturbs this idea. I think that's the point. We're out of time. What can I say? We did a lot on Matos. The rest of it was on Masei. So please God, another time we'll have to. That's how much there is to learn. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day.